In this instructional video, we'll go over the aorist passive and future passives for liquid verbs and irregular verbs. And the thing about liquid verbs is we already learned, for example, when we use meno, that in the aorist form, the liquid verbs sometimes undergo a slight stem change. So meno, I remain, if I want to say I remained, would be amena. This is the aorist active form for the liquid verb, where the stem change is inserting that iota into the verbal root men, and with the augment and the alpha tense formative, we have the aorist active indicative form, I remained. And what we'll discover is that for the passive forms, they also sometimes undergo a change, but the change is different from the active form, so it's not the same. So if you look at crino, for example, on this chart, and I filled out the chart for you just for the sake of time, the verbal root is crin, but notice that there is a change for the aorist passive only. In the aorist active, there is no change. So, and the aorist active middle form just simply uses crin, and there's no change. A crin is I judged. But if I want to say I was judged, notice that there is a change for the aorist passive form, which is a completely different paradigm. It drops the new, and you have cri. And so we have the augment, we have cri at the stem, and then we have the aorist passive suffixes, thein, and then if we want to do all the other forms, it'd be thein, theis, they, themen, they, theison. But here we just have the first person singular. And then if you wanted to show, and in the future, since the future passives follow the same paradigm as the aorist passives, anything that you see in the aorist passive will be reduplicated in the future passive forms, the passive forms. So there's no augment for the future, and you have that modified stem cri. You have theis as the tense formative that tells it's passive and future. The connecting vowel omicron, and the my, the primary middle passive suffix, and krithesomai is I will be judged. And so as we go down these different liquid verbs, notice that per vocabulary word, you might have to memorize a modified stem for the aorist passive and future passive forms. So apokrinomai, its verbal root is apokrin, but like crino, has a modified stem. And so what makes this different is the fact that it uses cri as the stem for the passive forms, whereas again it uses crin for the active forms for the same verb. With iro, the verbal root is r, and there is no change. Yay! So there is no change. The form, the aorist passive, you augment, and there's my augment. You use the verbal root, r, and then you add the thein, theis, they, themen, they, theison endings. So thein is I was taken or raised up. And then theisomai, we have the verbal root but without the augment. Then we have the tense formative theis, and the amai is the connecting vowel plus the primary middle passive suffix, and theisomai is I will be taken up or I will be raised up. So, and then we look at another verb, agero. Ager is the verbal root. Again, there's no stem change. Yay! And so you can see here's the augment, and then it uses the verbal root. You have the thein ending. Here's the verbal root, no augment because it's the future tense, and then you have the theisomai ending. That's the tense formative, the connecting vowel, and primary active suffix. Hiero, notice that there is no stem change. It uses the verbal root, but I shaded its form in yellow because this uses the second aorist form. So you don't see the theta. The theta has been dropped. There's no theta here. Instead, it's a hirein. Instead of a har thein, it's a hirein. and this is I was made glad, or if I translate it in a deponent way, I rejoiced. And then we have apakteno. Notice that its verbal root is akpakten with an epsilon, but wow, this is different. It does have a very different stem change. It uses an alpha. And so here is my augment, because remember that the apa is a compound verb and this is a preposition. So we have the augment here. We have this modified stem, apaktanthane. Apaktanthane is I was killed. And then we have apostello. Here's the verb apostel. Again, look at this. It uses the alpha for its modified stem. So apestalein, and this is also, notice that this is not only has a modified stem, but also uses the second aorist passive form. And so this apostelein is I was sent. And for the rest of these forms, if it has a double dash there, it means that it doesn't necessarily mean the form doesn't exist theoretically, but it just doesn't show up in the New Testament. So if you see these dashes, that means either the form doesn't exist, or it does exist maybe in secular discourse, but it doesn't show up in the New Testament, and so Mounce leaves the paradigm blank here. But when you look at meno, which is I remain, this is one that doesn't have a passive form. The reason why it doesn't have a passive form, because try to say remain in a passive way. It doesn't work because of what remain means, because of what meno means as a verb. The meaning of the word prevents a passive voice form. You can't say remain in a passive voice or abide in a passive voice. You can't say I was abided or I was remained. That doesn't make any sense in English nor in Greek. And so sometimes the form simply doesn't exist because the meaning of the verb doesn't allow it to exist.